Good evening, all. I take the pleasure of introducing our second keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Ashwin Mahalingam. Dr. Ashwin Mahalingam joined the faculty in the Building Technology and Construction Management Division of the Civil Engineering Department at IIT Madras in 2006. Ashwin received his BTech in Civil Engineering from IIT Madras and then proceeded to Stanford University for a Master's in Construction Engineering and Management. He then helped start up an internet-based company in the USA called All-Star Fleet, aimed at providing asset management services for construction companies. Following this, he returned to Stanford University to pursue a PhD in the area of infrastructure project management. Ashwin's research interests are in the areas of public-private partnerships in infrastructure planning and management, the management and governance of large engineering projects, and the use of technology in infrastructure development. Ashwin is also a co-founder of Okapi Advisory Services Private Limited and serves as a director on the board. He is the editor of the Engineering Project Organization Journal and has served on many national committees. Thank you for the opportunity. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Sir, before I hand you over to the microphone and the microphone to you, I'd like to request Mr. Anil Kumar Pillai to please join us on stage to do the honors, to present you with a small token of our appreciation. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Thank you, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, and it's a pleasure to be here for a couple of reasons. As Ravindra was saying, it's nice to actually have a live audience in front of you. But the real reason I'm happy is that I'm a civil engineer as well, and at some point I did study structural engineering, but I'm not a structural engineer. I work on project execution and project management. And generally what happens is we have a community of project managers and we have discussions like this, and we don't invite the structural engineers. And the structural engineers and materials people have their own discussions like this, and you don't invite us normally. So this is a wonderful opportunity actually for me to sort of talk to you and start cross-pollinating some of these ideas. So again, I'd really like to thank Engineer Muralidharan for inviting me to come and speak to you. My talk is not going to be very technical. It's more of a typical before dinner talk. I have a couple of points that I want to raise that are more philosophical in nature that we can debate. I'm assuming that most of you here are structural engineers. It is, after all, the structural engineers meet. And I'm pretty sure that you are some of the best structural engineers in the city. And generally, structural engineers tend to focus quite a bit on designing the best possible structures, which involve, as Ravindra was pointing out, trying to choose the best possible materials, trying to design it with the least possible volume of materials, the most durable structures, the strongest structures, and so on. And in that pursuit, sometimes lose sight of the fact that the structure that you're designing is part of a larger project, which is intended to create value somewhere. Right? So when we build a building, when we build a sports stadium, when we build a bridge, the whole point is it creates some kind of social and economic value. And sometimes we get so caught up in the details of what we're designing that sometimes we forget that big picture. And when you start looking at what happens to these projects from that macro perspective, you'll find that the scorecard is not particularly encouraging. Right? So we find that across the world, projects are often delayed, and projects are often above budget. They're not often built to the kind of specifications that we'd like them to be built. And I'd like to sort of emphasize the fact that this is, of course, it may not necessarily be very readable, but this is international data. Right? So everyone who thinks that India, we have a problem managing projects is wrong. The same problems we have in India, we have everywhere in the world. All right? Projects are just not done well enough. They don't create the kind of value that we expect these projects to create. Right? So the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, why is this the case, right? Why do we never get these projects done the way we would like them to be done, on time, on budget, the right kinds of quality, etc.? There are lots of explanations, but one thing that I'd like to sort of bring people's attention is the fact that over a period of time, projects evolve organizationally. This is some work that a colleague of mine from the UK, Nuno Gill, brought up some time ago, where he sort of pointed out that if you take something like the Chennai Metro Rail, for instance, when it's initially conceptualized, there are a few people in the room trying to conceptualize what that project is about. But as that project gets executed, we have tons of people coming in, providing information and making decisions. These could be designers, consultants, suppliers, vendors, stakeholders, users, project-affected people, people whose lands are being taken up for the project. All of these kinds of people come in and they have a view to express on these projects. And as you try and reconcile all of these views in terms of what is the supplier actually saying can possibly be supplied, how much is it going to cost, what are stakeholders saying in terms of design and so on, you find that project ideas start changing from what they were initially conceptualized as, right? So in some sense, the problem of project management is really not a problem of finishing things on time and on budget. The problem of project management is actually the problem of managing stakeholders and trying to create value in the process, right? So that's sort of a paradigm shift that we have to get ourselves around. We've been taught that project management is about execution, time and cost, right? And of course, there's quality somewhere, but primarily it's time and cost, right? And I'm here to tell you that it's not time and cost at all. It's stakeholders and value, right? As these projects demonstrate. It's a very interesting example of the London Olympics that came in at a budget of, on the far right, about £1 billion. Right, when London won the bid to host the 2012 Olympics, the Olympic Development Authority or whatever, they went to the Treasury and said, look, it's going to cost us £1 billion to run the Olympics. And the Treasury said, fine, we'll figure out how to raise £1 billion. And there were a handful of organizations, which is the column on the left that tells you that were there when that decision was made. When the project finally was delivered, the London Olympics cost £8 billion. Right, a cost overrun of 800%, right? This is in a developed country. And you'll find that there were about 1,000 odd participants who came in from, again, the various designers, material suppliers, etc., to the various sporting federations, to people, to the underground railway system that had to be refurbished to carry all the spectators to various events and so on, right? So you can see that over a period of time, many of these projects, particularly these mega projects, just change character. Right? And it's something that we often ignore when we talk about this, right? So I think we've got to sort of go back and say it's not about designing the most robust structure, it's about creating the greatest amount of value, right? So how do you create value? And by the way, just sort of before we move away from that, a lot of people look at all of our projects in India and say you're creating cost overruns. So the London Olympics was a disaster. Right, it cost 8x, whatever, your project cost twice as much or 1.5 times as much, so it's a disaster. Not always. Sometimes this increase in cost leads to an increase in value. So there's another station in the in the UK as part of a project called the High Speed Rail 2 project, right, which if you go and Google Euston Station, you'll find all of these articles on how terrible that project is in terms of its time and cost performance, which is true. It's hugely over time and over budget. But equally, there's a part of that story where the Euston Council essentially said, look, if you're just going to build this as a station as part of a rail network, it's not really going to benefit anybody. But if you thought of this station as a way to redevelop the suburb of Euston, to catalyze economic development, and therefore you develop the station in a way in which it attracts businesses, it attracts people, you not only develop the station, but you develop the area around the station, then you actually end up creating far more value. Right? And so Euston Station is an example of a project with huge cost overruns, but possibly a project that has created a lot of value and just has reshaped that area economically. Right? And again, what I'm encouraging is that all of us and all of you as structural engineers start thinking more about how do we not just design within the narrow constraints of the initial project brief, but design in a manner in which we create more Euston stations, right? We create more value. Okay? So to create value, you've got to look at efficiency. Right? And that's what we do. We look at building on time, cost, quality, durability, etc. But there are some other parameters that we need to consider. Right? We need to consider legitimacy. Right? Do people feel comfortable Do people want what you're building? Or are you creating these white elephants which are beautifully designed, built on time and on budget, but don't really serve the purpose that they're being built for, right? So, and ways of measuring that, are users satisfied? If there is a charge, a toll, for instance, are they willing to pay that kind of toll? Are you adding value to users? And are you sustainable and durable, not from a material perspective, but from a long-term economic perspective? Is that project delivering either economic or socio-economic returns, right? Internal rate of returns, etc., right? That are commensurate with or that meet expectations, okay? And various other things that I'm not going to really talk about. But again, when we think about value, right, we've got to think about all of these dimensions. And as engineers, this is essentially the framework that we need to adopt, okay? Why do we find it so difficult to create value, right? The reason we find it so difficult to create value is our project management systems are not designed to create this kind of value, right? This is our typical project management process, right? You start with some kind of a feasibility study, then you do detailed studies, you do designs, then you tender it out, you select a contractor, then the contractor comes and builds things, and then you operate. And this is seen as a very linear process, right? Where one stage is finished and is handed over to the next stage. And when we as project managers come in, this is all that we see, right? When we come in as project managers, we are told there is a design, there's a tender, there's a bid, somebody has won the project, here's an estimate, now manage the project, right? And that completely leaves out all of these other areas that really are critical to adding value, right? You don't add value by purely just by minimizing the time and cost of construction. You add value by optimizing the design so that more people benefit. Right? So one of the lacunae in project management 1.0, right, which is the traditional project management framework, is that project management starts during construction. What we really need to do is move away and say, look, project management needs to start right from conceptualization. So structural engineers need to be a part of project management, right? Not sort of the providers of drawings and details that then lead to project managers doing their work. Okay? So this is another issue. And this is what our industry looks like, right? We're siloed, right? There's the design people, there's the execution people, right? Things go wrong, design blames execution, and execution blames design, right? So this is, and by the way, this is also, quite starkly represented in most of our civil engineering curriculum, including the one at IIT Madras, which is 80% or 90% focused on design, very little focus on execution. Right? The problems that we actually face are in execution. So we essentially have a broken system. The way in which we manage projects today is not designed to create value. Or if it creates value, it comes with all this baggage. Where people say, look, time overrun, cost overrun, right? Project is a failure. So what do we need to do? This is where I think we're advocating this new paradigm of project management version 2.0, right? Over 1.0, which says, look, we need to be more collaborative. When I say collaborative, structural engineers and construction managers need to work far more collaboratively together, right? A lot of this has to be decentralized, planning and execution, all of this needs to be decentralized. We need to have much more collaborative ways of working where construction managers come in far earlier into the process. There's a lot more iteration along with not just the construction managers and the structural engineers, but also with stakeholders, also with potential users of the facility, potential people who live in the neighborhood of that facility, people whose lives are going to be impacted by that facility. How do we bring everyone in so that we design for the greatest amount of value? Okay. A lot of people are talking about this already, and there are lots of terms that you might hear which more or less all mean more collaborative, integrated ways of working. In the construction industry in India, Ravindra was mentioning this, we talk about lean construction, and lean is all about more collaborative working. There are people who call this integrated project delivery. This is the same folks in construction, but in the United States tend to call this IPD. If you're in the software industry, people talk about agile ways. Software, by the way, is a similar industry. It has design, it has execution, so they have these agile project management, again the same thing. NASA decided that they would have their own terminology. They call it project management at the edge. They all mean the same thing, right? They all mean more integrated, more collaborative, more flexible, more adaptable, agile ways of managing projects where there is far more communication. It's not a linear process. It's more of an iterative process. What does this look like? All of these lead to the same thing: improved coordination, faster response to change. We've talked about this. But what does this look like, right? What do we need to do? First, I think we all need to take collective responsibility for relooking at the way in which we write our contracts. Because currently, the way the contracts are written, they are what we call these win-lose contracts. They're highly antagonistic contracts. And they're also contracts that are written separately with separate people. The client has a separate contract with the designer, separate contract with the PMC, separate contract with the contractor. Right? And therefore, that fundamental nature of integration is just not there on projects. So we need to start rethinking. And when we talk about rethinking contracts, we always say it's somebody else's problem. I'm the designer, I'm here to design. Contracts is someone else's problem. I think we need to start taking collective responsibility. We need to move towards more integrated contracts, perhaps more design and build contracts, where construction and execution and design people come together. Right? So that's part one. Second, that's at the macro level. At the more micro level, we need processes on construction sites that lead to more interaction between designers, stakeholders, and engineers. There are all kinds of these lean processes that we talk about, right, that I won't get into in much detail. But all of this can be enabled by information technology, all right? Now, this is both the interesting and the sad part of all of this. All of us are information technology enabled, right? Today, structural engineering design is highly sort of computer aided and computer assisted, right? So you guys are working on digital ways in which you deliver structural designs. On the execution side, we have our own digital models as well. Digital models of the schedule, digital models of this, that, ERP systems where we monitor costs. But unfortunately, they're all different. They all don't talk to each other, right? Today, industry in the West is moving towards a platform that we are now calling digital twins, used to be called building information models, sort of just a fancier version of that, where we're saying, why can't we all work on the same platform? Why can't we have structural information, cost information, schedule information on the same platform? And why can't we use that to make optimal decisions on whether the structure is adding value to the stakeholders, whether the cost of the structure can be optimized, whether the carbon footprint of the structure or the energy consumption can be optimized? Why can't we use more integrated platforms? And again, this is a conversation that we need to have so that your data and our data can mix together on the same platform. Otherwise, we end up like this. Right? So I'm sure you guys have seen various varieties of this picture where, not sure how legible it is, but the one on the left is how the customer explained what they wanted. The next one is how the project leader understood what was required. The third is how the analyst, marketed the whole project. And then, of course, this is from IT, so the fourth one is related to a programmer. The fifth one is how the business consultant sold the project. How the project was documented. The next one is, what operations were initiated, how the customer was billed, right, for the nice expensive roller coaster. And then right at the end, that's what the customer wanted, right? All the customer wanted was a simple tire hung on a tree to swing, right? But because you have so much fragmentation in this industry, so many different people who have their own their own sort of ways of looking at it, you have digital models that are so disparate from each other, that you have a lot of confusion and coordination on construction sites, which is exactly what leads to delays, cost overruns, and a lot of value. So how do we get away from this? Is we start building our own integrated platforms, right, where we sort of speak to each other, we bring stakeholders into the mix. And this essentially is the essence of project management 2.0. So sort of to conclude, again, I've been talking a lot to people in the UK, so a lot of my examples are from there at the moment. Crossrail is a project, is one of the largest, I think it's the largest sort of rail project in modern history in terms of the amount that it's going to cost, reconnecting various parts of Europe. So people from Crossrail said, let's try to do things a little bit differently. Let's get our structural engineers, let's get our construction people, let's get some of our stakeholders, people who are going to be affected by this, the local council, politicians, whatever. And let's go to a university, in this case it was Imperial College, and sit down and talk about what is it that we're going to do differently on this project, okay? And they came up with an innovation strategy, right, in Crossrail. And it's it's available on the web. It's about 18 pages, it's not very long. But it was a bunch of people, collaborative, sitting together before the project started, saying, here's what we're going to do differently on this project, right? So the question is, and by the way, no Indian project that I know has an innovation strategy, right? So the question to all of us is, why can't we get together before we start a project and come up with an innovation strategy that blends the structural engineering expertise and the ability to design efficient, durable, sustainable structures with this notion of value creation, constructability, being able to build on time, etc., and sort of agree upon here are a few things we're going to do differently. So the challenge to us is, can we come up with more innovation strategies on our project? And that's, again, a fundamental principle of project management 2.0, right? But project management 2.0 is not simple, right? It requires us to rethink and develop a whole set of capabilities. So whenever I go to a construction site, somebody always asks me, says, are you a geotechnical person or a structural person or a mechanical person? I always get this question, right? Because we have sort of this view that international group that did a study on leadership in mega projects. So the idea was each of us would, and we're all from different countries, each of us would pick a mega project from our country and sort of look at the person who led that mega project and sort of write about it, right? How did that leader actually function? I actually wrote one, typically when we talk about leaders and mega projects, everyone talks about Mr. Sridharan and the Delhi Metro. So I thought I'd write about some other projects. So I wrote about the Nagpur Metro, which had another sort of technocrat leading it. There are case studies from all over the world, from Australia, from Norway, whatever. And when you look at the book is out, and I encourage you to sort of read it if you're interested in this sort of thing. But when we looked at these mega project managers from across the world, the one thing that's common to all of them, right, is that they are all multidisciplinary people, right? They are not structural people or geotechnical people or mechanical people or finance people. They're multidisciplinary. They understand a little bit of all of this, right? And this in some sense, and by the way, this is also true of Mr. Sridharan, right, of the Delhi Metro, is that he doesn't have a core technical expertise that differentiates him from other people, but he's able to see the big picture. So I think we need to start sort of training ourselves differently. Structural engineering is no longer just about deflections and shear forces and bending moments and those kinds of things, but is also about trying to figure out how does the economics of a project work and how do we create value, right? So a whole new set of capabilities, whole new set of processes where structural engineers are more tolerant of ambiguity, willing to let construction people come in earlier and have these sort of discussions on how we integrate design, construction, stakeholder management, etc. But I am sort of convinced that given the kind of numbers India is throwing out, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, our metro programs, high-speed rail, this, that, highways development program, the kind of mega projects that we're building, if we do not adopt this more integrated, collaborative way of working, I don't really see us succeeding in building the nation, as we were sort of saying, right? So I think really this is sort of a success or failure criteria at the moment. So in conclusion, all of us, structural engineers, construction managers, we need to do more, but we need to do more together, right? I need to sort of understand, people like us need to understand your world a bit better, you need to understand our world a bit better, we need to understand stakeholders and value, and hopefully in that process, we deliver better projects, right? Thank you very much.